The story of the Vikings clashing with the Islamic Empire is one of those hidden chapters of history that rarely makes its way into the mainstream narrative, yet it is a tale filled with audacity, cultural collisions, maritime daring, and the echo of swords clashing across the frontiers of two vastly different worlds. When people think of Vikings, the first images that come to mind are those of Norse raiders storming the monasteries of England, longships slicing through the cold waters of the North Atlantic, and warriors in furs and iron helms bringing fear to the coasts of Europe. On the other hand, the Islamic Empire is often remembered for its golden age of learning, trade, sprawling caliphates, and vast armies spreading across the Middle East, North Africa, and even into Spain. To imagine these two civilizations meeting in combat, trading goods, or negotiating power is to picture a dramatic clash of cultures where the northern seafarers met the desert lords of a global empire. The contact between Vikings and the Islamic world was not only real but transformative for both sides, though the full extent of their interactions often remains overlooked. It began with trade, as so many of history's greatest collisions do. The Vikings, known in the East as the Rus, navigated their dragon-headed longships down the rivers of Eastern Europe, through the forests and marshlands of what are now Russia and Ukraine, until they reached the Caspian Sea and even the Black Sea. These routes allowed them to connect with the mighty Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasid Caliphate, which at the time stood as one of the most powerful and advanced empires in the world. The Norsemen sought silver, a resource they valued immensely, and the Islamic Empire was overflowing with it. Dirhams, the silver coins minted in the heart of the Abbasid realm, became the backbone of Viking trade and economy. Archaeologists today still unearth thousands of Abbasid dirhams buried in hoards across Scandinavia, revealing the astonishing scale of this exchange. For the Norse, who lacked abundant silver mines, the flow of Islamic coinage was like lifeblood, fueling their raids, their craftsmanship, and their growing status as a trading power. But trade was not the only form of contact, for wherever the Vikings sailed, conflict followed close behind. The Caspian expeditions are particularly legendary. Bands of Viking warriors sailed down the Volga River, braving treacherous currents and hostile tribes, until they reached the Caspian Sea, where they launched daring raids against the Muslim towns and ports along the coast. One of the most famous of these took place in the 10th century, when a fleet of Rus warriors stormed into the region, capturing towns and instilling terror. They plundered goods, burned settlements, and spread chaos in lands that were not accustomed to the northern barbarians. The Muslim chroniclers of the time, who carefully recorded the arrival of these strange, tall, and ruthless invaders, described them with both fear and fascination. They noted the ferocity of the Vikings in battle, their unusual appearance with fair hair and blue eyes, their intricate tattoos that ran across their bodies, and their pagan rituals that shocked the sensibilities of Islamic society. Yet, despite their raids, the Vikings were not merely destroyers. They also integrated into the networks of the Islamic world in surprising ways. Some Vikings took service as mercenaries for Muslim rulers, selling their strength and loyalty for wealth. Others became traders who settled in frontier towns, mingling with locals and adopting aspects of Islamic culture. There are even accounts suggesting that some Norsemen converted to Islam, compelled by the trade advantages or drawn by the new faith they encountered. The blending of cultures was evident in the artifacts that remain. Islamic coins turned into jewelry by Norse craftsmen, Arabic inscriptions carved on Viking treasures, and exotic goods like silk and spices making their way into Scandinavian burials. This collision of civilizations was not a one-sided story of raiders versus empire, for the Islamic world also left an indelible mark on the Vikings. Through contact with Muslim merchants, the Norse were introduced to new technologies, new ideas of governance, and even different approaches to warfare. The Vikings, for all their strength, were never a unified empire. They were a patchwork of chieftains, warlords, and small kingdoms. But as they encountered the organized might of the Abbasid Caliphate, they began to recognize the value of larger political unity. The vast Islamic trade routes showed them the power of connectivity, of centralized authority, and of cultural sophistication that stretched from Baghdad to Cordoba. The Vikings carried some of these lessons back to the north, shaping the emerging states of Scandinavia and eventually even contributing to the foundations of medieval Russia. There were also moments of high drama and bloody confrontation that cemented the Viking reputation in the Islamic chronicles. One such episode was the siege of Barda in modern-day Azerbaijan, where a Viking army captured the city, ruling it for weeks in the 10th century before being struck down by an outbreak of plague. The sources describe the Vikings' brutality in sacking the town, but also their eventual downfall as disease ravaged their ranks, forcing the survivors to retreat northward. The clash was remembered as a tragic yet fascinating moment in the history of the Caucasus, where the raw northern warriors temporarily overcame the defenses of the Muslim world only to be humbled by fate itself. It is easy to imagine how these encounters must have appeared to each side. To the Vikings, the Islamic Empire was a land of staggering wealth, with exotic architecture, bustling markets, flowing rivers, and treasures beyond imagination. To the Muslims, the Vikings were wild barbarians, arriving suddenly in terrifying ships, bringing fire and steel, their gods alien, their customs shocking. And yet, between the terror of raids and the brutality of battles, there was also curiosity and exchange. Viking chieftains returned home with silks draped around their shoulders, with dirhams clinking in their pouches, and with stories of cities larger and richer than anything Scandinavia had ever known. Muslim merchants, meanwhile, wrote of these northern visitors who traded furs, amber, and slaves, whose manners were rough but whose courage was undeniable. The human stories behind this clash of civilizations are perhaps the most fascinating. Imagine the Norse warrior, accustomed to the cold fjords and dark winters of the north, stepping into the dazzling bazaar of Baghdad, surrounded by spices, perfumes, and scholars debating philosophy. Imagine the Muslim trader, used to desert caravans and the hum of urban life, gazing in awe at a Viking longship gliding silently across a river, its carved dragon head striking fear into anyone who saw it. The clash of legends was not only fought with steel but lived in these moments of astonishment and cultural encounter. Over time, the intensity of direct Viking raids against the Islamic world faded, but the legacy of their interactions endured. The Rus who had ventured into Muslim lands eventually became more settled, laying the foundations of Kievan Rus, the medieval precursor to modern Russia and Ukraine. These early states continued to trade extensively with the Islamic world, embedding Islamic silver deep into their economy and cultural identity. The Vikings themselves, through their exposure to the global reach of Islam, became more than isolated raiders. They became part of the broader tapestry of medieval history, connected to events in far-off lands that most of their European neighbors never touched. What makes the story of Vikings versus the Islamic Empire so compelling is that it challenges the stereotypes of both. The Vikings were not only raiders but explorers, traders, and cultural bridges who reached as far as Central Asia. The Islamic Empire was not only a distant power but a civilization that came face to face with the seafaring warriors of the north. Their clash was not a war of conquest in the traditional sense but a series of raids, sieges, trades, and encounters that revealed the interconnectedness of the medieval world. It was a reminder that even in the so-called Dark Ages, the world was far more global than many imagine, with silver from Baghdad ending up in Scandinavian soil, and northern warriors carving their names into the chronicles of Islamic historians. The untold story of Vikings and the Islamic Empire remains one of resilience, curiosity, and the raw force of human ambition. It was a clash not just of swords but of worlds, where icy fjords met scorching deserts, where pagan rituals brushed against Islamic prayers, and where legends were forged in the fires of conflict and the bonds of trade. The legacy of this encounter still lingers in the archaeological record, in the sagas and chronicles, and in the imagination of those who seek to understand how two seemingly distant civilizations once collided on the stage of history. In their clash, both the Vikings and the Islamic Empire found new dimensions of themselves, forever shaping the destiny of the North and the East, and proving that even the fiercest enemies can leave behind a legacy of connection as much as conflict. 1. Viking expansion routes leading to the Islamic world through rivers and seas. The Vikings were not confined to the cold northern seas. Their greatest strength was their ability to navigate rivers and coastlines with their versatile longships, vessels designed to cut through both open oceans and shallow streams. This mobility allowed them to explore far beyond the horizons known to other European peoples of the early medieval era. From their Scandinavian homelands, they moved eastward, traveling down the Volga and Dnieper rivers through the vast forested regions of Eastern Europe. These waterways served as highways to the south, eventually bringing them to the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and even the Persian Gulf in rare cases. Each river crossing opened doors to new cultures, economies, and conflicts. By connecting the North Atlantic to the Silk Road, the Vikings made themselves not just raiders but key participants in global trade, setting the stage for direct contact with the Islamic Empire. 2. The Abbasid Caliphate is a wealthy and powerful empire during Viking times. At the height of Viking expansion, the Abbasid Caliphate represented one of the most advanced and prosperous empires in the known world. Centered in Baghdad, which was a city of over 1 million inhabitants, the Abbasid realm stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Central Asia. The caliphs presided over an empire rich in trade, scholarship, and culture, creating a network of economic and intellectual exchange that connected China to Spain. For the Vikings, who came from scattered farming villages and small kingdoms, encountering the sheer scale of Abbasid wealth must have been awe-inspiring. Gold, silver, spices, silk, glassware, and advanced weaponry were abundant in the caliphate. Baghdad's House of Wisdom attracted scholars from across the world, and its markets overflowed with treasures unknown in the north. The contrast between the rugged simplicity of Viking homelands and the glittering sophistication of the Abbasid Empire created a clash that was both enticing and intimidating. 3. Viking hunger for silver and the role of Islamic dirhams in their economy. For Viking societies, silver was not just a luxury but an essential foundation for wealth, trade, and prestige. Unlike many kingdoms of Europe or the Middle East, Scandinavia lacked rich natural deposits of silver. This scarcity made silver coins, ingots, and jewelry extremely valuable in their economy. The Islamic world, particularly under the Abbasids, was the largest producer of silver dirhams in the medieval period, minting coins that were renowned for their purity and wide circulation. The Vikings quickly recognized this opportunity and sought to acquire dirhams through trade, raiding, or both. Islamic silver fueled Viking society, enabling them to pay warriors, forge alliances, and create lavish treasures for their chieftains and burial rituals. Hoards discovered in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway contain thousands of Abbasid coins, often cut into pieces to serve as bullion. The Islamic dirham, stamped with Arabic inscriptions, became an unlikely but vital currency in the Viking Age economy. 4. Archaeological evidence of Islamic coins buried in Scandinavia. Archaeologists have uncovered striking evidence of the Viking connection to the Islamic world in the form of coin hoards buried across Scandinavia. Fields in Sweden, Gotland in particular, have yielded enormous stashes of silver dirhams, sometimes numbering in the thousands. These hoards often date back to the 9th and 10th centuries, the peak of Viking contact with the East. The coins are typically Abbasid dirhams, minted in faraway cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Damascus, yet they ended up in burial mounds and hidden caches in the northernmost reaches of Europe. Many were deliberately cut or hacked into smaller pieces, suggesting they were used not as currency in a formal sense but as bullion for trade and wealth storage. The Arabic inscriptions on these coins sometimes confused their Viking owners, who occasionally repurposed them into pendants or amulets. These discoveries reveal a direct and undeniable economic link between the Islamic world and Viking Scandinavia. 5. Viking raids into the Caspian region and Muslim towns. The Vikings did not confine themselves to peaceful trade. Their hunger for wealth often drove them to violent raids, and the Caspian Sea region became a notable theater of Viking aggression. Sailing down the Volga River, Viking fleets reached the shores of the Caspian, where they targeted Muslim towns, ports, and villages. These raids were devastating because the people of the region were not accustomed to naval invasions. The Vikings would suddenly appear with their longships, storming coastal settlements with axes and swords. They looted goods, carried off slaves, and burned what they could not take. Muslim chroniclers recorded these invasions with horror, describing the destruction brought by these fierce northern warriors. These raids were not constant but came in waves, often when Viking chieftains needed wealth to consolidate power back home. The Caspian expeditions demonstrated the Vikings' boldness in venturing far from Scandinavia into the heartlands of the Islamic world. 6. Muslim chroniclers. Descriptions of the Vikings' appearance, customs, brutality. For many in the Islamic world, the arrival of the Vikings was their first encounter with northern Europeans, and the chroniclers who recorded these meetings were both fascinated and horrified. Writers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan described the Rus, Vikings who traveled down the Volga, in vivid detail. They were tall, muscular, and fair-haired, with piercing blue eyes that set them apart from the locals. Their bodies were covered in tattoos, snaking from their fingers up to their necks, which Muslim observers found strange and barbaric. The chroniclers also noted their brutal customs, including human sacrifices, slave trading, and open displays of sexuality, which scandalized Islamic sensibilities. Yet, they were also admired for their craftsmanship, their weapons, and their fearlessness in battle. Ibn Fadlan, in particular, gave detailed accounts of their burial rituals, which included burning ships and human sacrifice. These descriptions created a lasting image of the Vikings as both monstrous and fascinating outsiders. 7. The siege and capture of Barda by Vikings in the 10th century. One of the most dramatic episodes of Viking contact with the Islamic world was the capture of Barda, a prosperous city in modern-day Azerbaijan, in the mid-10th century. A Viking army, sailing down the Volga and into the Caspian Sea, marched inland and laid siege to the city. The defenders were overwhelmed, and the Vikings managed to seize Barda, ruling it for several weeks. Chroniclers describe the pillaging of the city, the terror of its inhabitants, and the foreign rule imposed by these strange northern invaders. Yet, the triumph was short-lived. A plague broke out within the city, devastating the Viking occupiers, who had no resistance to the disease. Weakened and unable to maintain their hold, they were forced to abandon Barda and retreat. This episode demonstrates both the strength and vulnerability of Viking expeditions. Though capable of seizing cities deep within Islamic territory, they were not immune to the forces of nature. 8. Plague and disease weakening Viking expeditions in Islamic lands. While the Vikings were fierce warriors and daring sailors, their expeditions often fell victim to forces beyond their control, especially disease. In their raids into Islamic lands, Viking forces sometimes stayed long enough to be exposed to local outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and other illnesses. Their bodies, adapted to northern climates, were often unprepared for the new pathogens they encountered in warmer regions. The siege of Barda is one of the most famous examples, where disease decimated the Viking garrison after their initial success. Such outbreaks forced them to abandon their conquests, retreating with heavy losses. For Muslim chroniclers, these events often seemed like divine justice, a punishment for the barbarian invaders who had desecrated their cities. For the Vikings, it was a brutal reminder that even their strength and courage could not guarantee survival. Disease was an equalizer, shaping the limits of Viking expansion into the Islamic world. 9. Viking role as traders bringing furs, amber, and slaves to Muslim markets. Beyond raiding, the Vikings engaged in extensive trade with the Islamic world, offering goods that were rare and highly valued in Muslim markets. Furs from the forests of Scandinavia and Russia were prized luxuries, used by the wealthy in the caliphates. Amber from the Baltic Sea was another coveted product, sought for jewelry and decorative purposes. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Viking trade was the slave market. The Vikings captured men, women, and children during their raids in Eastern Europe and transported them south to be sold in Muslim lands. Slaves were in demand for domestic labor, military service, and other roles within the vast Islamic economy. In return, the Vikings received silver, silks, spices, and exotic goods that transformed their society. This trading relationship reveals the complexity of Viking Islamic interactions, where commerce coexisted with violence, and where both sides benefited from the exchange of wealth and human lives. 10. Cultural exchange. Silks, spices, and exotic goods reaching Scandinavia. As the Vikings traded with the Islamic world, they brought home treasures that transformed life in the north. Silks, often dyed in brilliant colors, became prized possessions of Viking chieftains, used to display wealth and status. Spices such as cinnamon and pepper, though rare and expensive, began to appear in the diets of the wealthy, adding new flavors to northern cuisine. Glassware, jewelry, and ceramics from Islamic workshops found their way into Scandinavian burials, symbols of prestige and far-reaching connections. These goods did more than decorate Viking society, they reshaped it. Contact with the Islamic world introduced new fashions, broadened horizons, and deepened the Vikings' sense of participation in a larger world. A Viking chieftain draped in silk or drinking from an imported glass vessel was not merely displaying wealth but signaling his role as a global player. The cultural imprint of Islamic trade can still be traced in the archaeological record of Scandinavia. 11. Instances of Norsemen converting to Islam and blending into Muslim society. Though most Vikings remained devoted to their Norse gods or eventually adopted Christianity, there are accounts of Norsemen who converted to Islam during their interactions with the Muslim world. Conversion often provided practical advantages, particularly for traders who wished to integrate more fully into Muslim markets. In some cases, conversion may have been sincere, as Norsemen encountered a faith that emphasized order, discipline, and community in contrast to their own fragmented religious practices. Archaeological evidence, such as burial artifacts inscribed with Arabic phrases, suggests at least some level of Islamic influence. It is believed that small numbers of Norsemen settled in Islamic territories, marrying locals and assimilating into society. These individuals became cultural bridges, carrying knowledge of the North into the Muslim world and vice versa. Though never widespread, such conversions highlight the depth of Viking contact with the Islamic Empire, extending beyond trade and war into spiritual and cultural realms. 12. Vikings as mercenaries hired by Muslim rulers in frontier wars. Not all Viking warriors came south to raid. Some entered the service of Muslim rulers as mercenaries, selling their skill with the sword for gold and glory. Known for their ferocity and fearlessness, Viking fighters made formidable additions to any army. Muslim empires, constantly engaged in frontier conflicts with rival states, valued these foreign warriors for their effectiveness in battle and their loyalty when properly compensated. In some cases, Vikings became bodyguards for Muslim leaders, trusted to protect rulers from palace intrigue. Their presence in Islamic armies reflects the pragmatic side of medieval politics. Enemies on one front could become valuable allies on another. The Vikings themselves benefited by gaining not only wealth but also knowledge of advanced military strategies, weapons, and siege tactics. This service as mercenaries blurred the line between raider and ally, showing how fluid the relationship between the Vikings and the Islamic world could be. 13. The influence of Islamic governance and trade networks on Viking societies. The Vikings' encounters with the Islamic world exposed them to systems of governance and trade that were far more complex than their own. The Abbasid Caliphate operated with centralized authority, tax systems, and administrative networks that enabled it to manage vast territories efficiently. The Vikings, who came from small tribal and regional structures, observed the advantages of such organization. Though they never adopted Islamic governance wholesale, these encounters influenced the development of more structured states in the north. Kievan Rus, for example, drew inspiration from the political models they encountered through trade and conflict with Muslim regions. Likewise, the vast trade networks of the Islamic world demonstrated to the Vikings the power of connectivity, linking distant lands in a web of commerce. This realization encouraged them to think beyond raiding, fostering the growth of trading settlements and proto-cities that became the foundation of medieval Scandinavian states. 14. Viking encounters with the sophistication of Baghdad and other Islamic cities. For Viking traders or emissaries who traveled deep enough, encountering Baghdad would have been like stepping into another world. The city was the jewel of the Abbasid Empire, renowned for its size, wealth, and cultural vibrancy. With libraries, palaces, gardens, and bustling markets, Baghdad was unlike anything the Vikings had ever known in their rural homelands. Even smaller cities within the Caliphate dazzled with mosques, marketplaces, and urban life. To the Vikings, who were accustomed to timber halls and scattered villages, the architecture and refinement of Islamic urban centers must have seemed almost magical. These encounters not only enriched their material culture but also expanded their worldview. Baghdad and similar cities stood as proof of the scale of human achievement, offering lessons in trade, diplomacy, and even artistry. Though few Vikings reached the heart of the Caliphate, the impression of such cities echoed back into Scandinavia through stories and treasures. 15. Contrasting images. Vikings as barbarians versus Muslims as scholars and merchants. The cultural clash between Vikings and Muslims was as much about perception as it was about reality. To the Muslims, the Vikings were uncivilized barbarians, raiders with no respect for religion, scholarship, or refined living. Chroniclers described them as filthy, lacking modesty, and cruel in their treatment of captives. To the Vikings, however, the Muslims were wealthy but sometimes seen as decadent, soft, or overly ritualistic compared to their own rugged warrior ethos. Yet both sides held qualities that the other admired. Muslim writers noted the Vikings' courage and physical prowess, while the Norse respected the wealth and sophistication of the Islamic world. These contrasting images shaped the way each civilization remembered the other, casting the Vikings as brutal outsiders in Islamic records and the Muslims as exotic but powerful rivals in Norse tales. This duality reflects the complexity of their relationship. Both fear and fascination bound them together. 16. Stories of curiosity and awe between Norse warriors and Muslim traders. Beneath the violence and economic exchange, there were human moments of wonder when Vikings and Muslims encountered one another. Imagine a Norse warrior, clad in furs and armed with an axe, standing in a bazaar filled with spices, perfumes, and goods from China and India. His senses would be overwhelmed by sights, smells, and sounds utterly foreign to his northern world. Likewise, a Muslim trader meeting a Viking for the first time might be struck by his towering frame, tattooed skin, and strange pagan symbols. Stories must have circulated of these encounters, feeding curiosity about the world beyond. While chroniclers often emphasized brutality or moral judgment, the reality was likely more nuanced. Some Vikings admired the discipline of Islamic prayer or the beauty of Arabic script. Some Muslims marveled at the courage of northern warriors. These stories of awe remind us that history is not just conflict, but also fascination across cultures. 17. The eventual settlement of Rus states, Kievan Rus, shaped by these interactions. The Vikings who traveled eastward along the rivers eventually established settlements that grew into powerful states, most notably Kievan Rus. These early states were deeply shaped by their contact with the Islamic world, both economically and culturally. The steady flow of silver from Muslim lands provided the foundation for their wealth, allowing the Rus princes to consolidate power and build larger political entities. The influence of Islamic governance and trade networks gave them models for organizing their territories and managing commerce. Though Christianity would later dominate in Kievan Rus, the early exposure to Islam contributed to its cosmopolitan character, linking it to the broader medieval world. Without the interactions with the Islamic Empire, Kievan Rus might never have developed into the powerful medieval state it became. This legacy shows how the Viking-Islamic connection extended far beyond raids, shaping the very identity of a key medieval civilization in Eastern Europe. 18. The legacy of Islamic silver in the economic rise of Viking societies. The massive influx of Islamic silver had a transformative effect on Viking societies. It was not simply a matter of wealth. Silver reshaped their social and political structures. Chieftains used the wealth gained from dirhams to reward loyal warriors, solidifying their power and extending their influence. Communities grew wealthier, enabling them to build larger settlements, craft more advanced weapons, and establish trading posts that later evolved into towns. Silver jewelry became symbols of prestige, worn by both men and women to display status. The sheer abundance of Islamic silver circulating in the north gave the Vikings economic leverage, allowing them to engage in trade with European neighbors as well. The prosperity fueled by Islamic silver helped drive the Viking Age forward, sustaining their explorations, raids, and expansions across Europe and beyond. The role of Muslim coinage in Viking history is a striking example of global economic interdependence in the Middle Ages. 19. The clash of religions and rituals. Norse paganism meeting Islam. When Vikings and Muslims met, they also confronted each other's deeply different belief systems. The Vikings practiced a polytheistic religion centered on gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, with rituals that included animal sacrifices, feasting, and complex burial traditions. The Muslims, by contrast, followed the strict monotheism of Islam, guided by the Quran and daily prayers. For Muslims, Viking practices seemed blasphemous, especially their use of idols and sacrifices. For the Vikings, Islamic practices may have appeared overly restrictive, with their dietary laws and prayer schedules. Yet, these encounters also sparked curiosity. Some Vikings were impressed by the discipline of Islamic faith, while some Muslims were intrigued by the bold pagan rituals. Rare cases of conversion highlight the influence of these meetings, though for the most part, both sides remained steadfast in their beliefs. The clash of religions added another layer of complexity to their encounters, blending hostility with fascination. 20. The broader historical significance of Viking Islamic encounters in shaping medieval globalization. The story of Vikings and the Islamic Empire is more than a tale of raids and trade, it is a testament to the interconnectedness of the medieval world. At a time when many imagine Europe as isolated, these encounters reveal a global network stretching from Scandinavia to Baghdad, from the Baltic to the Persian Gulf. The Vikings were key players in this early form of globalization, linking northern Europe to the riches of the Islamic world. The Islamic Empire, in turn, extended its influence into distant lands through the flow of silver, goods, and ideas. These interactions shaped emerging states like Kievan,